All right, our beginning lesson in chapter 2 is called If-Then Statements. And if-then statements are a nice change of pace to what we were doing in chapter 1. And really, it's just it's a type of thinking that you can do every day as far as examples that come along throughout the course of a day. Write down lesson 2.1, write down the topic, if-then statements in your notes. All right, let's look at the statement, if it storms after school today, then we will not have practice. All right, this is just a typical sentence, right? But notice that there's a couple key words that I'm going to emphasize, and it's the word if, and it's the word then. And that's why this topic is called if-then statements, because an if-then statement utilizes the keywords if and then. Now, in the word, it says this is what is called an if-then statement or conditional. So in other words, when we have the keywords if, then, we can also call this a conditional. So I want you to write this statement, but before it, write the word conditional and then a semicolon. So in other words, if it storms after school today, then we will not have practice. This is called an if-then statement, or in other words, a conditional. They're interchangeable, so they mean the same thing. Sometimes we'll call it an if-then statement, sometimes we'll call it a conditional. Probably most of the time we'll call it a conditional. Now, in a typical conditional or if-then statement, the first part of the if part is called the hypothesis. Now the hypothesis is something, it's the part that's being tested. We're not sure if it's going to be true or not. So if this happens, the then part is called the conclusion. Or if the hypothesis does happen, and then this will happen as the conclusion. I just wrote it in the form using the letters P and Q. The P can be anything. So for example, if I go back up to the original conditional, up above with the storms, what's the if part? The if part is it storms after school today. That's the hypothesis. So in other words, the part that follows the word if is the hypothesis. The part that follows the word then, and I'm going to put that in yellow, the part that follows the word then, we will not have practice, is the conclusion. So in other words, if it storms after school today, that's the hypothesis. So if that happens, then the conclusion will be we will not have practice. So that's just typically a conditional as far as how it's set up. Now let's take a look at another conditional. So I just kind of reviewed at the top, if P, then Q. Remember the first part, the if part is the hypothesis, the then part is the conclusion. All right, let's take another example of a conditional. So I want you to write this down. If today is Monday, then tomorrow is Tuesday. All right, now in this, let's review this. Okay, what part is the hypothesis? So think about that for a moment. The hypothesis is the part that follows the word if. So the hypothesis, and I'll put it in the same color as I did before, the hypothesis is today is Monday. Notice I'm not including the word if, it's the part that follows the word if. What's the conclusion? The conclusion is the part that follows the word then. Tomorrow is Tuesday. So if today is Monday, the hypothesis, if today is Monday, that's kind of what we're testing. If that happens, then tomorrow is Tuesday. Now, we've got this term called a converse. Now, a converse is pretty easy to follow. And if you look at a typical conditional, but then look at this. The part that I just put a rectangle around is called a converse. What's the difference between these two? Looks like we've got the words if and the word then, but what's the only difference? Looks like we switched the hypothesis and conclusion around. So the converse of a statement is when we switch the hypothesis and the conclusion around. So notice that I took this conditional right here, and to find the converse of it, we're going to switch the conclusion and the hypothesis around. And that's what I did down here. So the conclusion of our conditional right here is, the converse is, if tomorrow is Tuesday, then today is Monday. Now what we'll start getting into is if conditionals or converses or both are true. Now let's go back to this conditional right here. Is this a true statement? Is that a true conditional? If today's Monday, is tomorrow Tuesday? And that's a true statement, isn't it? Now sometimes conditionals won't be true. Now is the converse of that true? Let's go down here. If tomorrow's Tuesday, then today must be Monday. Is that a true converse? And it is. So by coincidence, both of them are true. Now what we get into is we can write if-then statements in different forms. This is probably the most important set of notes that you need to do here. So make sure you've got this down. So I'm going to just write the words most important, because you're going to refer to these a lot in this chapter and actually throughout the book. All right, let's take a look. In general form, all right, our typical form of a conditional is like this. So if P, then Q. Now notice as I go through this, the red part is my hypothesis, or in other words, the part that follows the if. The blue part is always the conclusion, the part that follows the word then. So, let's write a conditional in if-then form. All right, here's an example. If 2x minus 1 equals 5, if I know that 2x minus 1 is equal to 5, then x must be equal to 3. Now, is that a true or false conditional? If 2x minus 1 equals 5, is x equal to 3? Let's see, if you put 2 times 3 minus 1 equals 5, 6 minus 1 equals 5, that's a true conditional. Again, we've got a true conditional. Remember, a conditional doesn't, sometimes they won't be true. Now, another way I could write an if-then statement is I actually can write it like this. I can use a little different wording. I can use the word implies. So P implies Q. So the first part is the hypothesis. The second part, the part that follows the word implies, is the conclusion. An example of that would be right here. 2x minus 1 equals 5 implies x equals 3. So in other words, this is the hypothesis of it, the part before the word implies. The part that follows the word implies is the conclusion. So all I want you to be concerned with right now is being able to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion when you have a conditional written different ways. So in other words, can you take a statement like this and identify the hypothesis and conclusion? Can you take a statement like this and identify the hypothesis and conclusion? How about like this? If we use the words only if, that's another way we can write a conditional. P only if Q. Now what part, where's the P part? Where's the red part? Right here, right? That's the hypothesis. So again, when we use the words only if, the hypothesis is right before and the conclusion is right after. So let's take a look at an example. Let's take that same 2x minus 1 equals 5 and the x equals 3, and let's rewrite that conditional using only if. Well, this is what it looked like this. The hypothesis goes first, 2x minus 1 equals 5, only if x equals 3. Here is my hypothesis, here is my conclusion. All right, now so far, what's typical in these three? What always came first? The hypothesis came first, right? And what always followed these kind of key words? The conclusion. So that's a way to remember this. Now, there's another way we can write a conditional in a final way, and it's using just the word if. Now notice if we use just the word if, the conclusion is written first, as I did here. x equals 3 if 2x minus 1 equals 5. So in other words, if the only word you're using is if, the hypothesis follows the word if, and the conclusion is actually first. So what I want to emphasize here is all these mean the same thing. They're just written in different forms. So in other words, if you see a statement like this, you know that the first part is the conclusion and the second part is the hypothesis. So you can take this statement and you could actually write it maybe in a little easier way. You could write it like this: if 2x minus 1 equals 5, then x equals 3. It's important to know all these different forms so that you can maybe relate it to a little easier form that you understand a little better. All right, let's take a look at a couple examples. Now, the main purpose of this introduction to Lesson 2.1 is to be able to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. Use your notes right here. The way I remember this is on all these 4 different forms, the only one where the first part is not the hypothesis is this one. And it's the word if, where you just have the word if. So let's see if we can remember that. All right, number 1, it says underline the hypothesis with 1 line and the conclusion with 2 lines. All right, let's take a look at number 1. Implies. All right. Now I'm going to look at these 4 things. Now I'm going to highlight actually the keywords. Implies, only if then. Now which one of these 4 is the one where the conclusion comes first? And hopefully you said this one, where you just have the word if. So all the rest of them, the hypothesis comes first. So I'm going to underline the hypothesis with 1 line and the conclusion with 2 lines. And number 3, the conclusion comes first. The conclusion, so 2 lines, and then the hypothesis follows the word if. The last one, hypothesis first, then conclusion. That's the main topic of this lesson. So it would be good if you rewound this and played it over a little bit just to emphasize that. Now, one last definition, if you want to call it that, is what we call a biconditional. What is a biconditional? Well, let's see. Suppose I have 2 conditionals. I've got 2 conditionals written here. One of them is if points are collinear, then they lie on the same line. So if points are collinear, then they lie on the same line. Now, is that a true or false conditional? If points are collinear, does that mean they lie on the same line? That's true. Now, I've got another conditional here. If points lie on the same line, then the points are collinear. Is that a true or false conditional? That is true. Now, what happens is if you have 2 conditionals that are true, we can actually rewrite it using the words if and only if. And sometimes to abbreviate this up, we'll write it like this. IFF, instead of writing if and only if out, IFF means if and only if. So when you have 2 conditionals, where both of them are true, and they're kind of relating to the same topics, obviously, we can write it as what we call biconditional. So, points are collinear if and only if they all lie on the same line. I could write it like that. Another way I could write it is I don't have to have this part first. I could have this part first. Points that lie on the same line, points lie on the same line if and only if they are collinear. Now really, both these biconditionals mean the same thing. So I guess the main thing I want you to understand is to be able to take a biconditional like this and realize that you can separate it into 2 conditionals. So in other words, a biconditional. Why is this a biconditional? Because it has the words if and only if. So I can take what I just put a rectangle around and I can separate it into 2 conditionals. Here's one of them and here's one of them. Another one, I should say. Or I could have taken this one and separated this biconditional into two conditionals, the same two. Now biconditionals is probably a little harder topic to understand. This is something we'll work with in class. So the topic was called if-then statements, or in other words, conditionals.